In January of 2024, I took a week off from everything. I was in the final year of my master's program in architectural history, and the previous semester had been a brutal, soul-crushing marathon of research, writing, and teaching assistant duties. My thesis, a deep dive into the repurposed industrial spaces of the Midwest, was consuming my life. All I wanted was a week of absolute nothingness in my apartment in Minneapolis. My place was a loft in a converted warehouse in the North Loop, a building I loved more for its history than its practicality. It had soaring ceilings, exposed brick walls that were always cold to the touch, and enormous original windows that offered a fantastic view of the snow-dusted city, but did very little to keep out the Minnesota winter. The building itself had a unique character. There were only a dozen units, and my neighbors were mostly quiet artists and tech professionals who, like me, valued their privacy. We had a modern intercom system at the main entrance. Visitors had to buzz a specific apartment, and we could talk to them and unlock the main door from our phones. It felt secure. On this particular day, a Tuesday, I was fully embracing my break. I had spent the morning reading a novel, completely unrelated to 19th century flour mills, and was now sprawled on my couch with a bowl of leftover takeout, half watching a documentary. The snow was falling heavily outside, a thick, silent curtain that made the city feel distant and peaceful. It was perfect. Around 8:30 that evening, the electronic buzz of the intercom cut through the quiet of my apartment. It was a jarring sound I rarely heard. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friends and family all knew I was in self-imposed exile for the week. I ignored it, assuming it was a delivery for another unit. A minute later, it buzzed again, longer and more insistent this time. With a sigh of annoyance, I got up and walked over to the wall-mounted tablet that served as the video feed. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy black and white image of the building's entrance. A man was standing there, his large frame filling most of the camera's view. He was older, probably in his mid-40s, with broad shoulders and a thick neck. He wore a heavy, dark coat, but no hat, and the snowflakes were melting in his thinning hair. I had never seen him before. He wasn't one of my neighbors. He stared directly into the camera with a strange, blank intensity. He buzzed my unit again. I muted the speaker on my end so he wouldn't hear me and walked over to my large living room window. My loft was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the main street and the entrance. I carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain, just enough to get a better look. From my vantage point, I could see him more clearly. His coat was worn and frayed at the cuffs. He stood perfectly still, his hands jammed in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the front door. There were only 3 other residents in the building at the time, and I knew all of them by sight. He wasn't one of them, nor did he look like a friend or family member who would be visiting. He had an air of displacement about him, as if he had washed up on this particular doorstep by accident. A logical person would assume he had the wrong building or the wrong name, but his persistent buzzing of my specific number felt targeted. My gut told me not to engage. I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the couch, trying to ignore the knot of unease in my stomach. I assumed he would eventually give up and leave. I put my headphones on and tried to lose myself in the documentary again, but the silence from the intercom was now more unnerving than the buzzing had been. After about an hour, my exhaustion from the semester finally caught up with me. The warmth of the apartment and the drone of the television lulled me into a doze. I eventually gave up, turned off the TV and shuffled off to my bedroom, which was at the far end of the long rectangular loft. I fell asleep almost instantly, a deep dreamless sleep. Sometime in the dead of night, I was violently ripped from my sleep by a sound. It wasn't a thump or a bang. It was a deep resonant boom that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards and into my bones. It was so loud and concussive that my first sleep-addled thought was that a car had crashed into the building. My heart was instantly hammering, my body flooded with adrenaline. I sat bolt upright in bed, straining to hear anything else over the ringing in my ears, but there was only silence. A profound, heavy silence that felt wrong. The quiet was what scared me the most. A loud noise implies an event, something happening. The silence that followed felt like the aftermath, the breath held in anticipation of something worse. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent on the cold concrete floor. I crept to my bedroom door, pressing my ear against the wood. I couldn't hear anything but the familiar hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the gentle hiss of the radiator. Everything sounded normal, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of intense dread. I slowly turned the handle and peered out into the main living area. The vast space was dark, illuminated only by the cold blue-gray glow of the city lights filtering through the massive windows. The snow had stopped, and the world outside looked pristine and still. Nothing in the living room or kitchen seemed out of place. My books were still on the coffee table. My empty bowl was on the counter. Yet the feeling of violation was overwhelming. I felt like I needed to be quiet, to not announce my presence, as if I were an intruder in my own home. I moved silently through the space, my eyes scanning every shadow, my body tense. I made my way down the short hallway that led from the main living area to the front door. And that's when I saw it. The door to my apartment, the one I knew I had locked and double-checked before bed, was wide open. It wasn't just unlocked. It was standing ajar, a dark, vertical slash leading out into the dimly lit building corridor. I froze, a wave of pure cold terror washing over me. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could it be open? Who had opened it? Was someone still inside? I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I retreated toward my bedroom, my eyes darting into every dark corner of the loft, expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows. On the other side of my bedroom door, the side facing the hallway, I saw a huge circular dent in the solid wood, right next to the doorknob. The wood was splintered, the force of the impact having cracked the finish. That was the sound I had heard. Someone had tried to break down my bedroom door with a single powerful blow. I slammed the door shut, twisted the lock, and wedged my desk chair under the handle. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate my phone as I hid in my closet and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, convinced that the intruder was still somewhere in my apartment, listening. The wait for the police was the longest 10 minutes of my life. The apartment remained utterly silent. When the police arrived, they cleared the loft room by room. It was empty. The intruder was gone. They found no signs of forced entry on my apartment's main door. The lock hadn't been picked or broken. They theorized that the man I had seen on the intercom had buzzed every apartment until someone, perhaps a new tenant who didn't know better or someone who was expecting a delivery, had let him into the main building. Once inside, he had come directly to my door. They couldn't explain how he got through my locked front door without damaging it, or why he chose my unit specifically. But the dent on my bedroom door told a clear story. He had entered my home while I was asleep, walked the length of my apartment, and tried to get into my room. The police suggested that the singular, powerful blow was an act of frustration. He had likely been surprised to find my bedroom door locked and had lashed out before fleeing, perhaps spooked by a noise from another apartment, or simply losing his nerve. I still live in that loft, but it has never felt the same. I have 3 new locks on my door, and I wake up at the slightest noise. The terrifying, unanswered question that haunts my nights is what he would have done if my bedroom door hadn't been locked. For the past few years, my 2 best friends and I have had a standing tradition for New Year's Eve. We all went to different colleges, so it was our one guaranteed chance to get together. We're not big on crowded parties, so we usually just rent a place for a night or two. For New Year's 2024, my friend Ben, the meticulous planner of our group, found a cabin on Airbnb in the Pocono Mountains. On paper, it sounded perfect. Secluded, rustic, and cheap. I carpooled with my other friend Marcus, and we met Ben there around noon on the 31st of December. The drive up was an adventure in itself, with winding mountain roads that got narrower the higher we climbed. Cell service vanished about 20 minutes before we arrived, adding to the feeling of complete isolation. The cabin was exactly as advertised, a log structure surrounded by dense woods. There were other similar cabins visible through the trees, but they were all a good distance away, giving us a sense of privacy. The inside, however, was a little less charming than the pictures suggested. It was clean, but there was a strange, musty smell. A creepy-looking taxidermy squirrel mounted over the fireplace, and the guest book on the coffee table contained a few unsettling entries about strange noises in the woods at night. We laughed it off, chalking it up to the rustic experience. We spent the afternoon catching up, playing video games on a portable console Ben had brought, and just enjoying the quiet. Around 6 in the evening, Marcus decided to head to the nearest town, a 30-minute drive away, to get some snacks and drinks for the countdown. While he was gone, Ben and I were sitting in the living room when there was a sudden loud knock on the door. We looked at each other, confused. We weren't expecting anyone, and the idea of a random visitor this deep in the woods was odd. I got up and peered through the small peephole. A man was standing on the porch. He looked to be in his late 50s, with a weathered face, a prominent scar running down his cheek, and a thick, unkempt beard. The cabin had one of those old-fashioned chain locks, so I slid it into place before opening the door a few inches. I figured it might be the host or a caretaker, so I didn't want to be rude. The man's eyes were cold and unfriendly. He didn't introduce himself or offer any pleasantries. His voice was a low growl. He told me that we needed to keep it down that night. He said he lived nearby and that people out here valued their peace and quiet. The way he said it felt less like a request and more like a threat. We hadn't been making any noise, just talking and playing a quiet game. And even if we had been blasting music, the cabins were so far apart that it was hard to imagine he would hear anything. There was something possessive in his tone, as if he owned the entire mountain. He finished by saying, "Things tend to get lost up here when it's not peaceful." I was too taken aback to argue. I just muttered, "Sure, no problem," and shut the door in his face. A second later, he banged on the door with his fist, a single heavy thud that rattled the frame. I ignored it, looking at Ben with a "can you believe this guy?" expression. After a moment, we heard his footsteps crunch away in the snow. When Marcus got back, we told him what happened. He was angry and wanted to find the guy, but we convinced him to let it go. We didn't want any trouble. We tried to forget about him and put on a movie. The hours passed, and soon it was almost midnight. As the movie's credits rolled, we heard a noise from outside. It sounded like a heavy rock hitting the side of the cabin. We all froze. A few seconds later, we heard the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. We jumped up and ran to the window. It was him, the guy from earlier. He was standing next to Marcus's car, holding a metal baseball bat. The car's windshield was completely smashed, with glass glittering on the fresh snow. The man looked unhinged, pacing back and forth and muttering to himself. Marcus completely lost it. All his anger from earlier came rushing back. "That's it. I'm going to kill him," he yelled, storming toward the front door. Ben and I grabbed him, trying to hold him back and telling him it wasn't worth it, but he was stronger than both of us. He shoved us aside and threw the door open. He didn't even make it off the porch before a gunshot cracked through the night air, deafeningly loud in the mountain silence. For a split second, I was sure Marcus had been shot. But then, in what felt like a miracle, he dove back inside the cabin, slamming and locking the door behind him. A couple more shots rang out, one hitting the log wall right next to the door with a loud thwack. Then we heard the man start swinging the bat against the door, again and again, the wood groaning under the impacts. We huddled together in the living room, terrified, with no way to call for help. Just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. We crept to the window and saw him jogging away, disappearing into the dark woods. We spent the rest of the night with the furniture pushed up against the door, jumping at every creak of the house. The police finally came the next morning after we managed to drive down the mountain until we got a sliver of cell service. They found the bat and a few footprints, but no shell casings. They spoke to the other cabin owners in the area, but no one knew who the man was. The theory was that he was some disturbed individual living off-grid in the woods, someone who saw us as intruders in his territory. It was a terrifyingly random and unpredictable encounter, a reminder of how quickly a fun getaway can turn into a fight for survival. I've been a state trooper in Wyoming for almost a decade. You see some strange things out on these long, empty stretches of highway, things that stick with you. Most of the job is routine. Speeders, fender benders, helping stranded motorists. But every once in a while, you stumble into a situation that feels like it's from a movie. A situation where the immense, silent landscape seems to be hiding a terrible secret. The night one found the old sedan on the shoulder of I-80 was one of those times. It's a memory that is seared into my brain, a short, terrifying chapter in my life that has no ending. It was late winter, near the end of February in 2023. The kind of cold that feels like it can crack your bones had settled over the state. I was working the graveyard shift, patrolling a desolate 50-mile stretch of the interstate between Laramie and Cheyenne. On a night like this, you're lucky to see another car every 10 or 15 minutes. The world outside my patrol car was a vast, dark emptiness. The only light coming from my headlights cutting a path through the darkness and the brilliant, cold stars in the sky above. The repetitive nature of the patrol can be hypnotic, and it's easy to let your mind drift. It was around 2 in the morning when I passed it. A dark-colored car, parked deep on the shoulder of the eastbound lanes. Its lights were off, and I didn't see it until I was almost right on top of it. I had been driving this same stretch for hours, and I was certain it hadn't been there on my last pass. My first thought was a possible drunk driver who had pulled over to sleep it off, or maybe a mechanical breakdown. I made a note of the mile marker, continued to the next exit a few miles down the road, and turned around to head back. It took me a good 15 minutes to get back to the spot. I pulled in behind the vehicle, parking about 50 feet back, and lit it up with my high beams and spotlight. It was an older model Honda Accord, maybe from the late 90s, and it was in rough shape. There were dents and scratches all over its dark blue paint, and a layer of road salt and grime covered it like a second skin. It looked tired and out of place. I followed standard procedure, calling in the license plate and my location to dispatch, reporting that I was investigating a seemingly abandoned vehicle. Then, I grabbed my large flashlight and stepped out into the biting cold. The silence was absolute. My boots crunched on the frozen gravel of the shoulder, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the dead of night. I did a slow walk around the car, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tires were all inflated, and there were no obvious signs of an accident. I approached the driver's side window and aimed my flashlight inside. The car was empty, but it wasn't clean. The interior was a chaotic mess. Fast food wrappers, empty water bottles, and old newspapers littered the floor. As I shined my light into the back seat, a feeling of deep unease began to creep over me. There was a pile of women's clothing scattered across the seat. It wasn't a suitcase that had spilled open. The clothes were just thrown there in a heap. A brightly colored floral dress, a pair of jeans, a sweater. On the floor, half hidden under the passenger seat, was a single high-heeled shoe. There was something about the scene that felt frantic and wrong, as if someone had been undressed in a hurry. I moved my light around to the passenger side, and that's when I noticed the dark reddish-brown stains on the fabric of the seat. They were small, but they were unmistakable. I took a step back from the car, my mind racing. This was no longer a simple abandoned vehicle case. A cold, professional dread settled in my gut. I was about to reach for my radio to update dispatch when I heard a sound from the darkness behind me. It was a faint, dry snap, like a twig breaking under a heavy boot. It came from the dense, dark woods that lined the highway. I immediately spun around, pulling my firearm from its holster and pointing my flashlight in the direction of the sound. "Wyoming State Patrol, show yourself with your hands in the air," I yelled, my voice sounding small against the vast, empty landscape. The sound stopped. I was met with a wall of absolute impenetrable silence, but I had heard it. I knew someone was out there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, watching me. My heart was hammering in my chest. My training kicked in, but the fear was real and palpable. The woods were thick with lodgepole pines and dense underbrush. Someone could be hiding just 20 feet away, and I would never see them. I slowly backed away, putting the relative safety of the abandoned car between me and the dark tree line. I raised my radio to my mouth, my voice low and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I updated dispatch on the situation, requesting immediate backup and advising that I had reason to believe there was an armed individual in the vicinity. Then I waited. Those next 5 minutes were the longest and most nerve-wracking of my entire career. I stood behind the cover of the Honda's trunk, my gun and flashlight trained on the woods, my ears straining to hear any sound over the pounding of my own heart. The silence was a physical presence. I felt like a target, completely exposed under the vast, starry sky. I kept replaying the scene inside the car. The scattered clothes, the dark stains. A story was unfolding, and I had just walked into the middle of it. I had a sickening feeling that I was not just a police officer who had discovered a crime scene, but that I had interrupted the person responsible for it. Finally, I saw the blessed sight of headlights approaching in the distance. As my backup officer's patrol car pulled onto the shoulder behind mine, I heard another sound from the woods. This time, it wasn't a stealthy snap. It was the frantic crashing sound of someone sprinting, running deeper into the forest, away from the light. With backup on the scene, we did a more thorough search of the vehicle. The situation only grew more disturbing. Tucked under the driver's seat, we found an empty cardboard package for a box of 9mm ammunition. The person in the woods wasn't just a potential suspect. They were likely armed. We also found a woman's purse wedged between the front seats, but there was no identification inside. No driver's license, no credit cards. It had been wiped clean. We secured the scene and waited for morning. As the sun came up, a full search team was assembled. They combed the woods for hours. They found a set of shoe prints that matched the frantic retreat I had heard, but the tracks faded out after a few hundred yards on the hard, frozen ground. The car itself was a dead end. The license plates came back as stolen from a different vehicle in another state, and the VIN number had been professionally removed from the dashboard. The car was a ghost. No one ever came forward to report a missing person who matched the potential evidence. No body was ever found. The case remains open, a cold file in a cabinet filled with unanswered questions. But for me, it's not just a file. It's the memory of a cold, silent night, the feeling of being watched from the darkness, and the chilling knowledge that I was standing just a few feet away from a predator. I often wonder what would have happened if I had arrived just a few minutes earlier or a few minutes later. I don't know what evil took place on that lonely stretch of highway, but I know that I looked it right in its hiding place, and for a few terrifying minutes, it looked right back at me. For nearly a year, my life ran on a reversed clock. I worked the 11 to 7 overnight shift at a gas station just off a state highway in the rural stretches of eastern Pennsylvania. It was a soul-crushingly boring job, but it was the only one I could find that paid enough to cover my rent and my car payment. Each night felt the same, an endless parade of tired truckers, insomniacs looking for snacks, and the low, constant hum of the fluorescent lights. The gas station was an island of artificial daylight in a vast sea of dark, rolling hills and farmland. On clear nights, the isolation felt peaceful. On snowy nights, it felt like being at the end of the world. This happened in the middle of a particularly cold snap in January 2023. I arrived from my shift to find the world covered in a crisp, thin layer of snow. My coworker, Dave, mumbled something about the night being dead and then quickly left, leaving me to my solitary vigil. My manager had left a short to-do list, but I knew it would take me less than an hour to complete. I decided to save it for the deep, quiet hours after 3 a.m. when the creeping exhaustion would make it hard to stay awake. I settled in behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, letting the time slip by. Around midnight, a vehicle pulled into the station. I glanced up from my phone and saw an old, dark green Ford Explorer, the kind that was popular in the late 90s. It was beat up, with rust creeping up from the wheel wells and a noticeable layer of road grime dimming its paint. It pulled up to one of the pumps, and then the engine cut out. I went back to my phone, expecting the driver to come in to prepay or use the restroom. But 10 minutes passed and nothing happened. I looked up again. The SUV was still there, dark and silent. The headlights were off, the doors were closed, and no one had gotten out. I stood up and walked closer to the front windows, peering out into the brightly lit forecourt. There was no one at the pump, no one walking around. A cold knot of unease started to form in my stomach. It was freezing outside, well below zero with the wind chill. The snow was blowing sideways in gusts. No one would just sit in a cold car for that long. I started to get a little worried for them. Maybe the driver had a medical emergency or had fallen asleep. After another few minutes of seeing no movement, I decided I had to check. I put on my heavy winter coat, pulled my hat down over my ears, and stepped outside. The wind was brutal, cutting right through my clothes. I hurried over to the SUV, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. I circled the vehicle, cupping my hands and pressing my face against the cold, tinted glass of the windows to peer inside. "Hello? Anyone in there?" "Just checking to see if you're okay," I called out, my voice sounding thin against the wind. The car was empty. The seats were vacant, and there was just some trash on the floor. It was completely, utterly abandoned. Now I was just confused. Why would someone drive to a gas station, park at a pump, and then just leave their car? I backed away, scanning the empty parking lot and the dark highway beyond. That's when my eyes fell to the ground. In the thin layer of snow, I saw a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's side door. But they didn't lead toward the front entrance of the store. They went around to the side of the building, toward the back, where we kept the dumpsters and the employee entrance. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I didn't want to investigate any further. I hurried back inside, the warmth of the store feeling like a sanctuary. I locked the door behind me and went back to the counter, my mind racing. I was trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the driver had to use the bathroom really badly and went into the woods behind the store, but nothing felt right. I stood by the small electric heater, trying to warm my numb fingers. I had only been inside for a minute when a heavy, muffled sound came from the back of the store. It was a solid, dull impact, like someone had stumbled and fallen against a shelf in the supply room. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The store was supposed to be empty. I was alone. I slowly walked around the counter and toward the back hallway. On the linoleum floor, I saw a small puddle of dirty, melted snow, exactly where someone would stand if they had just come in from outside. Following the faint trail of wet spots, I stepped closer to the doorway of the supply room. The room was dark, the lights switched off. Standing silently behind a tall metal shelf, stacked with boxes of paper towels and cleaning supplies, I could just make out the outline of a figure. It was a man, and he was huge. He was tall, with broad, powerful shoulders, and a large, scruffy beard that covered the lower half of his face. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing there in the dark, looking right at me. For a moment, I couldn't move or breathe. My brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. My fight-or-flight instinct short-circuited, and all I could do was stare back at the dark shape in the storeroom. Then, some strange, detached part of my brain took over. Without screaming, without running, I slowly backed away, turned around, and walked back to the front counter. I don't know why I reacted that way. Maybe I was in shock, or maybe some primal instinct told me that a sudden movement would trigger him. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I quietly lifted the receiver of the store's phone and dialed 911. I kept my eyes locked on the dark doorway to the supply room, whispering into the phone, begging for help. Then came the most terrifying 10 minutes of my life. I had to wait for the police to arrive, knowing that a giant, silent man was standing just 50 feet away from me in the dark. He never made a sound. He never came out. The silence from the back of the store was a living, breathing thing, full of terrifying possibilities. I had no idea what he was doing or what he wanted. Finally, I saw the blessed sight of flashing red and blue lights pulling into the parking lot. 2 state troopers came inside, their hands on their holstered weapons. I pointed, unable to speak, toward the back room. They went into search while I stayed by the front door, ready to run. I was shocked when they came back out a minute later, alone. The man was gone. The supply room's back door, which was always supposed to be locked, was standing wide open. Outside, a fresh set of tracks in the snow, led away from the gas station and straight into the completely dark, empty field that stretched on for miles behind the property. There was no way to search for him in the dark, not in that terrain. The police took the abandoned SUV, but it was a dead end. It had been stolen from a mall parking lot over 100 miles away 2 weeks prior, and its plates were fake. The man was a ghost. He left no evidence, no clues as to who he was or what he was doing in my gas station. I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't seen the footprints and gone back inside. What was he waiting for in the dark? The knowledge that he was there with me, silent and watchful, still fills me with a quiet, creeping dread that I don't think will ever go away. For the past few years, Christmas had become a complicated affair. My family lived in a suburb of Chicago, while I had built a life for myself as a software developer down in Austin, Texas. The distance made quick visits impossible, so the holidays were our one guaranteed time to reconnect. In December of 2022, I booked a week-long trip home. To avoid cramping my parents' style, I decided to rent an Airbnb in a nearby town, a nice, quiet place where I could have my own space to decompress after long days of family activities. The place I found was perfect on paper. It was a charming two-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a Christmas card. I arrived late on the evening of December 20th, exhausted from a long day of travel. The house was exactly as advertised, clean, cozy, and filled with the impersonal but welcoming decor of a well-maintained rental. I dropped my bags, made a quick video call to my parents to let them know I had arrived safely, and then collapsed into bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was woken by a series of noises coming from downstairs. It was a sequence of 3 or 4 soft, muffled thumps, like someone had dropped a heavy book on the floor. I lay in bed, half asleep, listening. The house was old, and I reasoned that old houses make strange noises. It was probably just the furnace kicking on or the pipes settling in the cold. I didn't feel particularly worried, just annoyed that my sleep had been disturbed. I rolled over and quickly drifted back to sleep, the sounds forgotten by morning. The next day was a blur of holiday errands and catching up with my family. I spent the whole day at my parents' house, returning to the Airbnb in the late afternoon to shower and change before we all went out for a big family dinner. As I was walking up the front path, I noticed a man standing on the porch. He was just standing there, facing the front door, his back to me. He hadn't knocked or rung the doorbell. I slowed my pace, a little confused. "Excuse me, can I help you?" I asked as I approached. The man turned around. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a thin, gaunt face and watery, unfocused eyes. He wore clothes that were too light for the chilly December air. He didn't seem to be all there. He just looked at me, nodded once, a quick, jerky motion, and then turned and walked away without a single word. He walked down the driveway and continued down the sidewalk until he disappeared around the corner. The entire interaction was profoundly strange and left me feeling unsettled. How long had he been standing there? What did he want? I brushed it off as a confused neighbor or a local eccentric and went inside, making sure to double lock the door behind me. At dinner with my family, I recounted the story of the strange man on the porch. Everyone had a theory. My aunt thought he was a confused elderly person who had wandered from a nearby nursing home. My dad suggested he might have been a door-to-door salesman who got cold feet. We all had a laugh about it, and their rational explanations made me feel better. The incident was downgraded from creepy to just quirky. I ended up leaving the dinner around 9 o'clock, feeling tired and ready for bed. The drive back to the Airbnb was quiet, the neighborhood dark and peaceful. I parked in the driveway, and as I walked up to the front door, I felt a familiar pang of anxiety. I looked around, scanning the shadows for any sign of the strange man, but the street was empty. Inside, everything was just as I had left it. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, kicked off my shoes, and let out a long sigh. I was safe. I was being paranoid. And then I heard it again. A sudden, loud thump that made me jump. It was the same sound from the previous night, but now that I was downstairs and wide awake, it was much clearer and louder. It was coming from the side of the house, from the direction of the attached garage. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, my ears straining. Another thump, this one followed by a distinct scraping sound, like metal on wood. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. This was not the house settling. Someone was in the garage. My mind raced back to the layout of the house. There was a door in the hallway that connected the main house to the garage. I crept out of the kitchen and into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer to the garage door, the sounds became more distinct. It was the sound of someone trying to force a lock, the sound of a body being thrown against the door, the sound of splintering wood. And then, in a quiet moment between the violent noises, I heard the faint, ragged sound of heavy breathing from the other side. I didn't wait to hear any more. I grabbed my keys and my phone from the counter and ran out of the front door, not even stopping to put my shoes on. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped down the street. Once I was a few blocks away, I pulled over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. I waited in my car for the police to arrive, watching the house from a safe distance. When they got there, I watched as they surrounded the house and went inside. A few minutes later, an officer came to my car and told me the most horrifying part of the whole ordeal. The person in the garage was gone. The interior door leading from the garage to the house was heavily damaged, with deep pry marks and a splintered frame. The lock had almost given way, but what they found was that the small side door of the garage, the one that led to the backyard, had been left unlocked. The police believed that the man I had seen on the porch earlier was the intruder. They thought he had been casing the house, and when I left for dinner, he had simply walked into the backyard and let himself into the unlocked garage. He had been in there the entire time I was at dinner, waiting for me to come home and go to sleep, before trying to break into the main part of the house. The thumps I had heard the night before, that was likely his first attempt. He had been in my house, or at least on the property, for over 24 hours, just waiting for his moment. The knowledge that I had been sleeping in that house while someone was right below me in the garage, trying to get to me, was sickening. I never spent another night in that Airbnb. I gathered my things with a police escort and stayed at a hotel for the rest of my trip. The incident ruined my holiday and left me with a deep, lingering paranoia. I still think about that man's empty eyes and the horrifying realization that the only thing separating me from him was a single, flimsy interior door that was slowly being torn apart. During my sophomore year of college, in December of 2023, I was working as a delivery driver for a local pizza place called Tony's. It was a classic college job, and a few of my friends worked there too, which made it bearable. I was saving up for a spring break trip, so I was picking up every extra shift I could get my hands on in the weeks leading up to the Christmas holiday. The nights were long and often stressful, especially when the weather was bad. This particular night was one of those. A heavy, wet snow had been falling since the afternoon, turning the roads in our North Carolina town into a slushy mess. Deliveries were taking forever, and the orders were stacked up. The phones ringing off the hook with people who wanted a hot pizza without having to brave the elements. Around 9:30, I grabbed my next run. It was a double order, 2 separate addresses in the same general direction. I loaded the pizzas into the insulated bag on my passenger seat and plugged the addresses into my phone's GPS. Both deliveries were in a massive, sprawling subdivision about 15 minutes from the shop. It was one of those neighborhoods that have been built in stages over several decades. The front part was new and well lit, with tidy lawns and expensive-looking houses. But the deeper you went, the older and more neglected it became. The roads got narrower, the streetlights became sparse, and the houses grew smaller and farther apart. The first delivery was uneventful. It was in the newer section, a nice family who gave me a generous tip. I got back in my car and set the directions for the second house. The GPS took me deeper into the labyrinthine neighborhood, down a series of winding, unplowed roads. My little sedan struggled in the snow. I'd finally reached the address and found myself at the end of a dark cul-de-sac. The house was the only one on the street, set far back from the road and surrounded on all sides by a dark, dense forest. It was a small single-story house that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in years. There were no lights on except for a single dim yellow bulb above the front door. A wave of unease washed over me. I parked on the street, grabbed the 2 pizza boxes, and made my way up the long, unshoveled walkway. I knocked on the door and waited, the cold seeping through my thin jacket. The only sound was the wind rustling through the pine trees. After what felt like a full minute, the door creaked open. A middle-aged woman stood in the doorway. She looked like she had just been woken up. Her hair was a tangled mess, her eyes were heavy and bloodshot, and she wore a stained, oversized sweatshirt. She looked at me with a tired, emotionless expression. "I have your order. 2 large pizzas," I said, trying to sound cheerful as I held out the boxes. She took them from me without a word and placed them on a small table just inside the door. She told me to wait a moment while she got the cash, her voice a low, raspy mumble. She left the door open and disappeared into the dark house. Another minute went by. I was starting to get really cold and antsy. She finally reappeared at the door, holding a crumpled wad of bills. She began to count the cash with agonizing slowness, her fingers fumbling with the notes. There was something deeply unsettling about her. Every movement was sluggish and deliberate, as if she were moving through water. As she was struggling to count, she started trying to make small talk. She asked me how my day was, if it was busy because of the snow, normal questions that sounded completely bizarre and out of place given the circumstances. It felt like she was stalling for time. At one point, while she was recounting the money for the 3rd time, I glanced back at my car, mostly just to break eye contact with her strange, vacant stare. And that's when my blood ran cold. Crouched down by my passenger side front tire, almost hidden in the shadows, was a man. He was looking into my car windows and appeared to be doing something to my door, maybe trying to wedge a tool into the lock. My head snapped back toward the woman. In that instant, her entire demeanor had changed. The tired, emotionless mask was gone. Her eyes were now wide with a cold, furious anger. She knew that I had seen him. Before I could react, she lunged forward and grabbed my arm. Her grip was like a vice. She started yelling to the man by my car, a shrill, panicked scream. He turned, saw me, and started sprinting up the walkway toward us. The woman was trying to drag me inside the house. Pure, primal instinct took over. I shoved her with all my strength, breaking her grip, and then I ran. I didn't run back toward my car, where the man was now blocking my path. I bolted off the porch and straight into the dark, snowy woods that bordered the property. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush right behind me. I ran blindly, stumbling over roots hidden by the snow, tree branches whipping at my face. The forest was dark, but the moonlight reflecting off the snow provided just enough light to see. I kept running for what felt like an eternity until, finally, the sounds of pursuit began to fade away. After several minutes of sprinting, I stopped, gasping for air, my lungs burning in the cold. Luckily, I had my phone. I navigated my way through the trees until I emerged on another street in the subdivision. I saw a house with its lights on and ran to the porch, dialing 911 as I went. The police arrived quickly. One patrol car came to my location while another went to the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. They found the couple. The man was outside, still in the act of trying to break into my car. The story that came out later was chilling. The couple were addicts, completely broke and desperate. They had developed a system of targeting delivery drivers. The woman's role was to stall the driver at the door with a confusing payment and awkward conversation, giving the man enough time to break into the driver's car and steal any cash, wallets, phones, or anything else of value. I was just supposed to be another victim in their routine, but because I saw the man, their plan fell apart. What they would have done to me after dragging me inside the house is a question that I am profoundly grateful I will never have the answer to. I was just thankful to have gotten away, my life saved by a single lucky glance. For years, My annual ice fishing trip to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was my sanctuary. I'm an engineer from Detroit, and the quiet solitude of the frozen wilderness was the perfect antidote to the noise and stress of city life. I'd rent the same small bare-bones cabin on a remote lake every February. It was privately owned, miles down a logging road, and had only the essentials: a wood stove, a bed, a table, and not much else. There was no cell service, no internet, no distractions. Usually, I'd bring a friend, but sometimes, like in the winter of 2024, I went by myself. I had never had any issues before. The profound silence and isolation were what I craved. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the snow packed deep on either side of the narrow road. The cabin was just as I remembered it. A single dark log room with a commanding view of the vast white expanse of the frozen lake. I spent the rest of the day setting up my gear, splitting some wood for the stove, and settling in. As darkness fell, I brewed some coffee and sat by the fire, reading a book. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the groan of the wind outside. It was perfect. I fell asleep early, feeling a deep sense of peace. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, eager to get out on the ice. The air was crisp and brutally cold. I bundled up in layers, packed my gear onto a small sled, and started the 10-minute walk from the cabin down a short, forested path to the edge of the lake. My boots were the first to mark the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. I found a promising spot, drilled a hole through the thick ice with my auger, set up my lines, and settled onto my small stool to wait. For me, the act of fishing is a form of meditation. I sat there for hours, watching the steam from my breath cloud in the frigid air, feeling completely at one with the stark, beautiful landscape. Around midday, the wind started to pick up, and the sky grew heavy with the promise of more snow. I decided to pack up and head back. As I walked off the lake and back onto the forested path, I immediately saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a second set of footprints in the snow. They were not mine. They ran alongside my own tracks from earlier that morning, leading from the woods right up to the edge of the lake where I had been fishing. It looked as if someone had followed me down to the lake, stood there watching me from the cover of the trees, and then turned around and walked back up the path toward my cabin. A feeling of profound unease settled over me. I was supposed to be completely alone out here. The cabin's owner was the only other person who even knew I was here. My initial calm was shattered, replaced by a sense of being watched, of my solitude being violated. I chose to follow the strange prints, my hand resting on the hilt of the large knife I carried on my belt. The tracks followed the path directly back toward the cabin, but just before reaching the small clearing where the cabin stood, they veered off sharply, heading straight into the dense, dark woods. As far as I could see, they continued in a straight line, pushing through thick undergrowth and between ancient pine trees. It was bizarre. Any normal person would have stuck to the path. This felt like the movement of an animal, or something that was intimately familiar with the deep woods. Slightly unnerved, I went inside the cabin and locked the door behind me. I stoked a fire in the wood stove, the flames doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep inside me. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like footsteps. The cozy, safe feeling of the small room was gone. Now, it felt like a fragile wooden box in a vast, indifferent wilderness that was hiding a secret. As the sun set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, I made some food, but had little appetite. I sat by the window, watching the woods, my book forgotten on the table. About an hour after dark, I heard it, a very faint rhythmic crunching sound in the snow outside. It was the unmistakable pattern of someone walking, slow and deliberate. I moved away from the window, my heart starting to pound. I crouched down and peered out from the side of the frame. A figure emerged from the trees, from the same direction the footprints had gone. They were wearing thick, dark winter clothing that covered every part of them, making it impossible to tell if they were a man or a woman. Their face was completely obscured by a deep hood and a scarf wrapped around their head. They moved with a strange, calm purpose. Once they reached the path, they turned and started walking directly toward my cabin. I ducked my head down, my back pressed against the wall below the window. I just listened as the footsteps grew closer and closer until they were right up against the log wall of the cabin. The footsteps moved to the side, coming to a stop directly outside the window I was hiding under. I could see their shadow fall across the floorboards. Then I heard a faint scratching sound on the glass. Against my better judgment, driven by a horrifying need to know, I slowly tilted my head up and looked. The person was there, their hooded face just inches from the pane of glass, peering inside. I couldn't see any features, just two dark, hollow voids where their eyes should have been. I recoiled, stumbling backward and away from the window. The person didn't smash the glass or bang on the wall. Instead, they did something far more terrifying. They calmly reached up and began to try and lift the old, heavy window sash, their gloved fingers scraping against the wood. It was a quiet, patient, methodical attempt to get inside. I grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, my only real weapon, but I knew I couldn't stay and fight. This was not a normal encounter. While the person was still focused on the window, I ran for the door, unlocked it, and burst outside. I sprinted to my truck, my feet slipping in the deep snow. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers numb and clumsy. As I jammed the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life, I risked one last glance back at the cabin. The figure was no longer at the window. They were standing in the middle of the path, motionless, just a dark, silent shape watching me leave. I threw the truck in gear and sped away down the logging road, not looking back again. I don't know who or what they were, but they knew I was there. They had watched me, and they had come for me in the dead of night, not with violence, but with a quiet, terrifying patience. They turned my sanctuary into a place of absolute horror. I took a job working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station in the fall of 2023. It was located in a quiet, sleepy suburb of Portland, Maine, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The pay was decent, and the hours allowed me to help my mom with my younger sister during the day. I told myself it was temporary, but the nights were long and incredibly lonely. The store was always brightly lit with humming fluorescent lights that made everything feel sterile and unreal. The huge plate glass windows at the front made me feel like I was on display in a fishbowl for anyone passing by in the dead of night. For the first few months, the job was exactly as boring as I'd expected. My only company was the low hum of the drink coolers and the occasional late-night driver stopping for gas or coffee. Then came a particularly cold night in December. A fresh layer of snow covered everything, muffling the world in an eerie silence. Around 2 May, the bell over the door chimed, and a man walked in. He was tall and thin, and he smelled powerfully of gasoline and stale cigarettes. He walked right past the aisles and up to the counter, but he didn't look at me. Instead, he leaned over and began methodically scanning the room, his eyes lingering on the security cameras and the employee-only door behind me. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, my voice making him jump. He flinched like he'd been caught doing something wrong and hadn't realized I was standing right there. He hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously before he mumbled, "No, I'm good," and practically bolted out of the store. It was weird, but I'd seen my fair share of strange people on the night shift. I watched him get into an old beat-up sedan parked in a dark corner of the lot and drive away. I tried to shrug it off, but a seed of unease had been planted. There was something about the way he cased the store that felt wrong. I spent the next half hour trying to busy myself, wiping down counters and restocking shelves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing out the windows at the empty, snow-covered parking lot. I even called my manager to mention the weird encounter, but he just laughed it off. "You get all sorts of weirdos on the night shift, Mike. Don't worry about it," he said. His dismissal just made me feel more alone. Not even a minute after I hung up, the same beat-up sedan pulled back into the lot. It didn't pull up to a pump or a marked spot. It circled the lot once, slowly, before parking in the exact same dark corner as before, just outside the direct line of sight of the main security camera. The engine was left running, a low, threatening rumble in the quiet night. I couldn't see inside the car because of the glare on the windows. My unease turned into real fear. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. My hands were trembling as I picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. I tried to keep my voice steady, reporting a suspicious vehicle that had returned after a strange encounter. The dispatcher sounded bored and told me she'd send a car to swing by when one was free, but it might be a while. After I hung up, I saw one of the car doors open just a crack, then slowly close again. They were waiting, debating. That was it for me. I quickly locked the front doors and retreated to the small windowless back office, where a grainy monitor displayed the feeds from the security cameras. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding, watching the silent car on the screen. What felt like an hour later, but was probably only 10 minutes, I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car pull into the lot. The relief was so intense, it almost made me sick. I watched on the monitor as a single officer got out and cautiously approached the sedan. To my surprise, the two men inside the car didn't put up a fight. They got out with their hands raised and were cuffed without any resistance, which seemed strangely compliant. The officer came inside to take my statement. He looked shaken. He explained that after he cuffed them, he did a routine search of their trunk. It wasn't a robbery they had been planning. What he found was a meticulously assembled kit. There were rolls of duct tape, heavy-duty zip ties, a roll of thick black plastic sheeting, 2 shovels, and a large bag of lye. It was a kill kit. The officer told me the men were the primary suspects in a string of disappearances of lone individuals from rest stops and gas stations along the interstate. They weren't there for the money in my cash register. They were there for me. I quit the next morning. I never went back. The knowledge of what was in that trunk and what my fate was supposed to be that night is a horror that has never left me. For the last couple of years, I've been driving for a food delivery app to make ends meet. Back in the winter of 2023, I was deep in my 3rd year of a graphic design program, and my trusty old laptop was on its last legs, constantly overheating and crashing right before deadlines. A new machine powerful enough for my coursework was ridiculously expensive, so I was picking up every shift I could during the month-long winter break. My college town, nestled in the foothills outside of Denver, was a great place for it. People with money would pay a premium to not have to venture out into the Colorado snow. This particular night was a gold mine. A blizzard had rolled in around sunset, dumping heavy, wet snow that turned the roads into a slushy mess. Most other drivers had logged off for the night, which meant the orders were flooding in, each with a heavy weather bonus attached. I was driving my dad's old Ford F-150, a beast of a truck that handled the icy conditions better than my own small sedan. For about 3 hours, I was flying, making great money, and feeling like the king of the road. The heater was blasting, my music was on, and I was in a good rhythm. I told myself I'd do one more big order before calling it a night. Just then, an order popped up that made my eyes widen. It was a pickup from a fancy downtown burger place, and the delivery address was 25 minutes away in Cherry Hills Village, a notoriously wealthy enclave of sprawling mansions and private roads. The payout was huge, almost $100 with the tip, blizzard bonus, and distance. I accepted it without a second thought. There was nothing unusual about the order itself. It was just a couple of burgers and fries. I picked up the food, placed the warm, greasy bag on my passenger seat, and started the long drive out of the city. As I left the main roads, the streetlights became sparse, and the houses grew farther and farther apart. The plow trucks clearly didn't venture this far out. The snow was piling up, at least a foot deep on the unpaved side roads, and the truck's tires crunched loudly as I navigated the winding lanes. The neighborhood was old money, and it showed. The houses weren't modern glass and steel structures. They were colossal stone and brick mansions, set far back from the road behind imposing wrought iron gates and ancient-looking trees whose branches were heavy with snow. They looked dark and silent, like sleeping giants. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. My GPS finally announced that I had arrived. The address led me to a long, unlit driveway that was completely untouched. covered in a thick, smooth blanket of snow. It was obvious no one had driven in or out for hours, maybe all day. Not wanting to risk getting the truck stuck, I pulled over to the side of the main road, switched on my hazard lights, and grabbed the food. The walk up the driveway was tough. The snow was up to my shins, and the cold air burned my lungs with every breath. As I got closer to the house, I realized all the lights were off. Not a single window was lit. It was a massive, dark shape against the snowy landscape. Taped to the huge, dark wood front door was a piece of paper. As I stepped onto the porch, stomping the snow off my boots, I leaned in to read it. At the top, in large, aggressive red letters, it said, "Notice of foreclosure." Below that, it detailed legal actions issued by the county. It was a strange detail for a house that had just ordered $100 worth of food. Before I could process it, I heard the distinct sound of someone walking in the snow behind me. It was a heavy, crunching sound, slow and deliberate. I spun around, my heart jumping into my throat. A man was approaching from the side of the house, near the garage. He was tall and thin, with a shaved head that was already dusted with fresh snow. He wore a thin, dirty canvas jacket that looked completely inadequate for the blizzard. He wasn't even shivering, which was somehow more unnerving. I tried to break the tense silence. "Just dropping off your order," I said, my voice sounding weak against the howling wind. He didn't respond. He just kept walking toward me, his boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were dark and exhausted, but there was a strange intensity in them. He looked right through me. A gut feeling, cold and sharp, told me something was terribly wrong. He slowly held out a pale hand, not for the bag of food, but just open, as if he expected me to give him something else. I cautiously extended the bag toward him. He took it, but his eyes never left mine, and he didn't move to go inside. He just stood there, blocking my path back to the driveway, the food forgotten in his hand. Seconds stretched into what felt like a minute. The only sounds were the wind and my own frantic heartbeat. "Well, have a good night, sir," I finally managed to say, trying to sound casual. I took a step to the side, intending to walk around him. He remained perfectly still for a moment before he abruptly turned. In my peripheral vision, I saw his arms swing out, his fingers spread wide as if to grab my jacket. I stumbled backward, losing my footing in the deep snow and falling onto my back. He was on me in a second, stepping forward and reaching down. "Come with me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. I scrambled backward, kicking snow into his face as I tried to get up. He kept coming, his voice rising. "Stop running! You need to come with me." Fear gave me a burst of adrenaline. I found my footing and turned, sprinting through the deep snow as fast as I could. It felt like running through water. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him chasing me, his heavy breathing getting closer. I finally reached the road and fumbled with the truck's door handle, my fingers numb and clumsy. I threw myself inside, slammed the door, and locked it just as his face appeared in the window, his expression blank and terrifying. I jammed the key in the ignition and threw the truck into reverse. The tires spun uselessly for a horrifying moment before they finally caught, and I shot backward onto the road. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the driveway, motionless, just a dark figure watching me disappear into the swirling snow. Once I was miles away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone, I called the police. They went out to the house, but the man was gone. They told me later that night that the foreclosure notice was real. The family who had lived there had vanished a month prior, leaving everything behind. The police had no idea who the man was or what he was doing there. All they found were his footprints, which circled the dark, empty house over and over again. I quit my delivery job the next day. Now, whenever I see a house with its lights off, I feel a knot of dread in my stomach, wondering if he's still out there, waiting in the dark. By my junior year of college, my roommate and I had our Christmas routine down to a science. We both attended a small liberal arts school in a quiet corner of Massachusetts, And since our families lived on opposite coasts, traveling home for the holidays was an expensive and logistical nightmare. So, we created our own traditions. My roommate, a perpetually cheerful business major named Ben, was the social architect of our duo. He was all about festive parties and eggnog. I, on the other hand, was an English literature student named Ethan, and I preferred quiet nights, old movies, and the company of a good book. Our dynamic worked perfectly. On Christmas Day of 2023, we spent the morning in our small, drafty rental house, exchanging the cheap, thoughtful gifts we'd bought each other. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a pale orange glow on the snow-covered neighborhood, Ben started getting ready for a big party over at the campus athletic house. He tried to convince me to come along, promising it wouldn't be as loud and chaotic as I was imagining, but I just wasn't feeling it. I was tired from a brutal finals week, and the thought of navigating forced holiday cheer with a bunch of strangers was my personal definition of torture. I told him to go have fun and that I would be perfectly happy holding down the fort. He left around 6, and for a couple of hours, the solitude was bliss. I made myself some dinner, put on a classic black and white Christmas movie, and settled onto our lumpy couch. But as the night wore on, the quiet of the house started to feel less like peace and more like a heavy, pressing silence. The movie ended, and I found myself aimlessly scrolling through my phone, feeling a strange, restless energy. I decided a walk might clear my head. The cold air, I thought, would be invigorating. I bundled up in my heaviest coat and stepped outside. The night was beautiful in a stark, wintry way. The air was so cold it felt sharp in my lungs, and the snow under my boots made a satisfying, crisp, crunching sound. The houses in our neighborhood were all decorated, their cheerful lights creating warm, inviting pools of color in the darkness. I walked for a while, just enjoying the quiet and the festive scenery. My route eventually took me toward a small park that sat in the middle of our neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a small playground and a few benches, all of it now buried under a thick blanket of snow. As I walked along the path that cut through the park, my eyes were drawn to a figure sitting on one of the benches. It was a man, and his presence there was immediately jarring. The park was dark, with only a single weak lamppost casting a sickly yellow light. It was also brutally cold, far too cold for anyone to be just sitting outside. As I got closer, the details became clearer and more unsettling. He was just sitting there, his hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead into the darkness of the trees. He wasn't wearing a hat or gloves, and his jacket looked thin and inadequate. When I passed by, his head turned slowly, and he looked right at me. It wasn't a curious glance or a friendly nod. His eyes were completely empty, devoid of any emotion, and they seemed to look right through me. It was a cold, predatory stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A wave of primal fear washed over me. I didn't run, but I quickened my pace, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I kept my eyes forward, but I was acutely aware of him, a silent, menacing presence in the corner of my vision. I didn't dare look back until I had reached the end of the path and was back on the familiar, well-lit street. When I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, the bench was empty. For a second, I felt a wave of relief, thinking I had imagined the whole thing. But then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the park, partially hidden by the shadow of a large oak tree, just watching me. Now, I was truly scared. I started walking faster, almost jogging, the festive lights of the houses no longer looking cheerful, but like the eyes of indifferent spectators. All I could think about was the warm, safe light of my own house, which was now just a block away. I kept thinking about his eyes, that complete and utter void of emotion. I fumbled with my keys at the front door, my fingers numb and clumsy from the cold and the fear. I finally got the door open, slipped inside, and locked it behind me, leaning against it and breathing a heavy sigh of relief. I took off my shoes and coat, my adrenaline slowly starting to recede. I was safe. It was just a weird guy, a harmless eccentric. That's what I told myself. But just as I was about to walk away from the door, I heard a soft, dull thump from outside. It was the sound of a heavy boot stepping onto the wooden porch. My blood ran cold. I knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. I crept back to the door and peered through the peephole. My heart felt like it was going to explode. It was him, the man from the park. He was standing on my porch, so close that his face filled the entire fisheye lens. He was just standing there, staring at the door with that same blank, empty expression. His face was pale and gaunt in the yellow glow of the porch light. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't ringing the bell. He was just waiting. I have no idea why I did what I did next. Maybe I was in shock, or maybe some foolish part of me thought a normal human interaction could diffuse the situation. I cracked open the door, just a few inches, keeping the chain lock securely fastened. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The man looked at me, his emotionless eyes meeting mine. He didn't say a word. He didn't even seem to be breathing. "Are you okay?" I tried again. "Do you need something?" Still nothing. Just that silent, unnerving stare. Getting profoundly creeped out, I slammed the door shut and engaged the deadbolt. I went back to the peephole. He remained on the porch for what felt like an eternity, motionless. Then, he slowly walked off to the side, out of my view. I heard his boots crunching in the snow as he moved toward the side of the house. I raced to the living room window, and my heart sank. The curtains were wide open. From the side of the porch, he would have a perfect, unobstructed view into my living room, where the Christmas tree was lit up, illuminating the entire space. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, terrified to move, not wanting him to see me. I knew I should call the police, but I was paralyzed by fear, my mind unable to form a coherent plan. I just stood there in the dark, listening. That's when I heard a dull thud come from outside the window. I stepped back, my eyes wide with terror. The man was standing right outside the glass, his face just inches away. In his hand, he held a large, jagged rock from the edge of my garden. His eyes were still glazed over, showing no anger, no excitement, nothing. It was the complete absence of emotion that was the most terrifying part. He lifted the rock and slammed it against the glass. The window didn't break, but a spiderweb of cracks appeared with a sickening crunch. I finally snapped out of my trance. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed my phone, and locked myself in the small pantry, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. As I whispered to the operator, I could hear him hitting the window again and again. Then there was a pause, followed by a new sound. He had moved back to the front door and was now hammering on it with the rock. The wood splintered and groaned with each impact. It went on for what felt like forever, and then, just before I heard the distant wail of sirens, it went completely quiet. When the police arrived, he was gone. The window was shattered, on the verge of collapsing, and there were large, deep gouges in the front door where he had relentlessly attacked it. The police took my statement and searched the area, but they found nothing. They theorized that he was likely an intoxicated or mentally unstable person who had latched onto me for no specific reason. Whatever the case, he had turned my safe, cozy home into a place of terror. Ben came home a few hours later to find me sitting on the couch with all the lights on, staring at the broken window. We boarded it up with cardboard for the night, but I didn't sleep at all. I just kept seeing that empty, emotionless face, and I knew that if he had gotten inside, he wouldn't have just stolen my belongings. He would have taken everything. I bought my first house in the fall of 2023. It was a small, cozy bungalow in a quiet suburb of Buffalo, New York, and I was immensely proud of it. As a freelance web designer, I worked from home, so my house was my sanctuary, my office, and my entire world, all wrapped into one. I loved the peace and quiet, but as winter approached, I started to understand the true meaning of lake effect snow. The storms that rolled in off Lake Erie were legendary, capable of dumping feet of snow in a single night and cutting the city off from the rest of the world. In early January, we were hit by a monster of a blizzard. For 2 days, the wind howled like a hungry animal, and the snow fell so thick and fast that you couldn't see the house across the street. The governor declared a state of emergency, and all non-essential travel was banned. I was completely snowed in, and I was perfectly fine with it. I had a full pantry, a stack of books, and a roaring fire in the fireplace. It was the perfect excuse to be a hermit. On the second night of the storm, around 7 o'clock, I was sitting on my couch, the news murmuring in the background about road closures and power outages. The wind was slamming against the house with such force that the windows were rattling in their frames. I got up and went to the large window that overlooked my backyard, mostly out of curiosity to see how bad it really was. At first, all I could see was a swirling vortex of white. The visibility was almost zero. But then, through a brief lull in the snowfall, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure. A person was walking through my backyard. My yard was large and unfenced, backing up onto a small patch of woods. In normal weather, it wouldn't have been entirely unusual to see someone cutting through. But in the middle of a historic blizzard with a travel ban in effect, it was insane. The person was just walking at a normal, steady pace, heading from the woods toward the street at the far end of my property, before the swirling snow and the darkness swallowed them from view. I stood at the window for a long time, trying to convince myself that my eyes had been playing tricks on me, but the image was burned into my mind. I was worried for them, but I was also deeply unnerved. Who would be out in this? And why were they cutting through my yard? I went back to the couch, but I couldn't focus on my book. I kept replaying that fleeting image in my head. Not even 5 minutes later, there was a loud, insistent knock at my front door. It was so out of place against the roar of the storm that it made me physically jump. My first thought was that it had to be the person from the backyard. I went to the door, my heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. It was a man, and he looked to be in a bad way. He wore a heavy winter jacket, but it was caked in snow. His face was pale and almost blue from the cold, and his nose was a bright, angry red. He was shivering uncontrollably. It was impossible to know for sure, but I was almost certain it was the same person I had seen. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the wind. The man managed a weak, humble smile, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. He told me that his car had broken down a few miles away and that he had been walking, trying to get to his brother's house. He said his brother was on his way to pick him up, but he was freezing and asked if he could please just wait inside my house for a few minutes to get out of the cold, just until his ride arrived. My mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. On one hand, my sense of self-preservation was screaming at me not to let a strange man into my house. On the other hand, my compassion was telling me that this person was in genuine danger of freezing to death on my doorstep. It's easy to say you would never let a stranger in, but when you are faced with a person who is visibly suffering and asking for your help, the decision is not so black and white. I decided on a compromise. I told him he couldn't come inside, but that he was welcome to wait on my covered front porch, which was at least sheltered from the wind and the direct snowfall. I also offered to get him an old jacket and a blanket. The man's friendly expression faltered for just a second, a fleeting look of disappointment crossing his face before he nodded gratefully and went to sit on the small bench I had on the porch. I closed and locked the door and went upstairs to my bedroom closet to find my old ski jacket, one that I never wore anymore. I also grabbed a thick wool blanket. As I walked back down the stairs, a strange, powerful gut feeling stopped me in my tracks at the bottom step. It was a sudden, inexplicable wave of pure dread that told me not to open the door. I don't know what it was, but I've learned to trust those feelings. Instead of unlocking the door, I crept over to it and looked through the peephole again. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The man was no longer sitting on the bench. He was standing right up against my door, his body pressed against it. He wasn't shivering anymore. His hand was on the doorknob, and his body was braced as if he were preparing to push the door open with all his might, the second the lock was disengaged. His face, which had looked so pathetic and helpless just minutes before, was now a mask of cold, predatory focus. He had been lying. The whole story was a lie. I backed away from the door as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my throat. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the phone what was happening, my eyes wide with terror, locked on the door. I knew what was waiting for me on the other side. As I was on the phone with the dispatcher, I heard a faint scratching sound at the lock. He was testing it. The dispatcher told me that because of the blizzard, it would take a while for a patrol car to get to me. She told me to stay on the line and lock myself in a safe room. I crept back to the peephole one last time. He was gone. The porch was empty. He had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, like he somehow knew that I had seen through his act and had called for help. The police eventually arrived, but there was nothing to find. There was only one set of footprints in the snow on my porch, leading up to the door and then leading away, disappearing back into the swirling chaos of the blizzard. I never found out who he was or what would have happened if I had opened that door. But I know that I came terrifyingly close to letting a monster in out of the cold. A monster that the storm itself seemed to have delivered right to my doorstep. The thought of his focused, waiting face on the other side of the door still haunts me. After my roommate of 4 years, Chris, got married and moved out in the summer of 2023, the house felt unnervingly large and quiet. We had rented a small 2-story home in a sprawling suburb just west of Chicago, and for the first time, I was living completely on my own. I decided to stay for another year, enjoying the extra space and turning Chris's old bedroom into a home office. I worked in IT support, and my company had recently shifted to a permanent remote work model, which suited my introverted nature just fine. The days were filled with the familiar rhythm of troubleshooting calls and keyboard clicks, but the nights, especially as winter set in, were long and silent. This particular story happened in early December of that year. Our area was in the grip of a severe lake-effect snowstorm. The weather channels were issuing blizzard warnings, advising everyone to stay off the roads. For days, a relentless wind had been whipping snow off Lake Michigan, burying our neighborhood under a thick white blanket. My company, being proactive, had told everyone to work from home for the entire week. I was grateful. The idea of navigating the treacherous roads was not appealing, and I was content to be sealed inside my warm house. I was in my makeshift office, staring out the window at the swirling snow, when I heard a knock at the front door. It was a firm, solid rap, not the light tap of a package delivery. I was immediately on edge. I wasn't expecting anyone, and no one in their right mind would be out walking around in this weather. I muted my work call and crept downstairs. Through the small, frosted pane of glass in the front door, I could see the silhouette of a man standing on my porch. Hesitantly, I opened the door a few inches, a blast of icy wind and snow rushing into the house. The man on the porch was middle-aged, with a kind, weathered face and a thick, graying mustache covered in tiny ice crystals. He wore a heavy winter jacket, but he was shivering violently, his teeth chattering. He smiled apologetically, his expression one of pure exhaustion. He explained his situation in a rush of words. He said his car had slid off the road and gotten stuck in a snowbank just a few houses down. His phone was dead, and he asked if he could possibly use mine to call his brother for a tow. My mind immediately went to all the horror stories you hear about letting strangers into your home. But looking at this man, who seemed genuinely distressed and on the verge of hypothermia, I felt a pang of guilt. I told him to wait a moment and close the door, locking it. I went to the living room window, which had a clear view of the street he was talking about. Sure enough, there was a small sedan nosed into the massive snowbank created by the plows, its hazard lights faintly blinking in the whiteout conditions. His story seemed to check out. Still, I wasn't going to let him inside. I put on my own jacket and boots, grabbed my phone, and went back to the front door. I told him I'd rather not have him come in, but that I would stand on the porch with him while he made the call. He looked a little disappointed but nodded in understanding. He called his brother, and I could overhear parts of a seemingly normal conversation about getting a truck with a winch and how bad the roads were. After a minute, he handed my phone back, thanked me profusely, and said his brother was on his way but might be a while. He then walked back toward his stranded car. I went back inside, relieved that the situation was resolved without any issue. I went back to work, but I found myself constantly glancing out the window at the stuck car. An hour passed, then 2. The man was still sitting in his vehicle, the engine presumably running to keep him from freezing. I started to feel uneasy. How long could it possibly take for his brother to get here, even in a storm? As evening fell and the sky turned a dark, inky gray, the car was still there. I made dinner, watched some television, and tried to put it out of my mind. But the blinking hazard lights were a constant nagging presence in my peripheral vision. Around 9:30, I decided to head upstairs and take a hot shower before bed. The warm water felt incredible, and for a few minutes, I finally relaxed, the sound of the storm and the presence of the strange car fading into the background. That's when it started. A sudden violent banging on the front door shattered the peace. It wasn't a knock. It was a percussive, brutal assault. It sounded like someone was throwing their entire body weight against the door, over and over again. The whole house seemed to shake with each impact. I could hear the wood of the door frame groaning and the aggressive, frantic rattling of the doorknob. I was frozen in place, the water still running, my heart pounding in my ears. The sheer, unexpected violence of it was paralyzing. It was a sound of pure, desperate chaos. I turned off the shower, my mind racing. Who was it? The man from the car? His brother? Why were they trying to break my door down? I quickly threw on some clothes, my hands shaking. As I stepped out of the bathroom and into the upstairs hallway, the banging stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The house was plunged back into a terrifying silence, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. I stood motionless at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing. The silence was somehow more menacing than the noise. I slowly crept down the stairs, my eyes fixed on the front door, expecting it to burst open at any second. I peered through the peephole. There was no one on the porch. The porch light cast a pale yellow glow on the fresh, undisturbed snow. I ran to the living room window and looked out. The stranded car was still there, but now the driver's side door was wide open and the man was gone. Not knowing what else to do, I called the police. When they finally arrived, navigating the treacherous roads, they found the front door was heavily damaged, with deep indentations and splintered wood around the lock. But it was the footprints in the snow that told a more disturbing story. There weren't just one set of tracks leading from the car to my house. There were two distinct sets. One belonged to the man I had helped. The other set belonged to someone else, someone who had come from the opposite direction. The two sets of prints met near my porch, and the snow was scuffed and trampled, suggesting a struggle had taken place right outside my door. Then, both sets of tracks led away from the house together, disappearing down the unplowed street. The police impounded the car. They ran the plates and got a name and a photograph of the owner. It was the same man I had spoken to on my porch. But when they checked his records, they found he had been reported missing by his wife 2 days earlier. He never made it home that night. As far as I know, he was never seen again. The police were never able to figure out what happened. Was the man running from someone, desperately trying to get into my house to find safety? Or was he the danger, part of a team trying to get inside, and the banging was a distraction or a ruse? The thought of that violent struggle happening just feet from where I was standing, separated only by a thin wooden door, is something I will never forget. I was in the middle of a story I didn't understand, a story whose terrifying conclusion played out in the snow just beyond my doorstep. By February of 2024, I was running on fumes. I was juggling a full course load of online classes for my nursing degree and driving for a food delivery service every spare moment I had to pay for tuition. It was a grueling schedule, and most nights I was exhausted. This particular night was no different. It was just after 11 p.m., freezing cold, and a light, persistent snow was falling. I had promised myself I would log off after one more delivery. Of course, that last order was a leave-at-door delivery that took me way out into the rural part of the county, down a long, unlit road connecting two small towns in central Ohio. The drive out was eerie. There were no streetlights, no other cars, and the landscape was just flat, dark fields on either side, covered in a thin layer of snow. As I was driving down this 5-mile stretch of nothingness, a deer suddenly bolted out from the trees. I instinctively swerved, my tires hitting a patch of black ice hidden beneath the snow. The car went into a slow, graceful slide that I had no control over. It wasn't a violent crash. It felt more like the car just gave up and decided to lie down. It came to a stop in the shallow ditch on the side of the road, tilted at a steep angle. The engine was still running, but the wheels were sunk deep in a mixture of snow and mud. I was completely stuck. My phone had only 1 bar of service. With a sigh of frustration, I called my dad. The connection was terrible, his voice cutting in and out. I explained what happened, and he promised to call a tow truck for me and then start heading my way. But he warned me he was at least 45 minutes out. After we hung up, an intense silence descended. The only sound was the wind whistling past my car. The feeling of being so alone and helpless started to creep in. That's when I saw them, a pair of headlights far down the road, coming from the direction I'd just been. At first, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it was a patrol car or just a kind stranger. But the car was moving strangely. It would inch forward, stop for a few seconds, then inch forward again, almost as if the driver was cautiously assessing the situation. It felt predatory. It got within a couple hundred yards of me, and then its headlights just cut out, plunging me back into absolute darkness. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Had they seen me? Why would they turn off their lights? My imagination went into overdrive. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where the car had been, trying to see any movement in the dark. A few minutes later, which felt like an eternity, I saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was a person, walking slowly up the side of the road, directly toward my car. It wasn't a normal walk. It was a slow, deliberate trudge through the snow, like he had all the time in the world. As he got closer, my headlights illuminated him. He was a large man wearing a dark hooded Carhartt-style jacket, the kind every other guy in Ohio owns. The hood was pulled up, completely obscuring his face in shadow. He didn't stop a safe distance away. He walked right up to the edge of the ditch, so close I could have reached out and touched his boots if I'd opened my door. He just stood there, just outside the main beam of my headlights, a towering, silent figure. I was terrified. I gave my horn a few short beeps, a pathetic attempt to show him I was in the car and I could see him. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, perfectly still. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own ragged breathing and the frantic thump of my pulse in my ears. He stood there for a full 5 minutes, motionless, watching me. Just as I was reaching for my phone to try calling my dad again, the man did something incredibly strange. He slowly raised one hand, almost as if he were about to wave, but then he just let it drop back to his side. He turned around without a word and walked back the way he came, melting back into the darkness. Shaking, I managed to get my dad on the phone again. I whispered what was happening, and he told me he was only a minute away. As he was talking, I saw headlights again. But this time, they didn't stop down the road. They pulled up directly across from me, blocking the entire road. My blood ran cold. A car door opened. "Sarah, what's happening? Who is that?" My dad yelled through the phone. I couldn't answer. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, another pair of much brighter lights appeared, coming around the bend at high speed. It was my dad's truck. He laid on the horn and flooded the scene with his high beams. The other car's door slammed shut, and it peeled out, tires squealing as it sped off into the night. My dad pulled up behind me and ran to my window. He was pale and frantic. He had seen more than I did. As the strange car was pulling up, the man had been walking back toward my car, and this time he was carrying something long and metallic, like a tire iron. He was heading straight for my driver's side door when my dad's headlights hit him. The police came and took a report, but the man and the car were long gone. When the tow truck finally pulled my car out of the ditch, the driver pointed out fresh scuff marks and a small dent right next to my door handle. He had been trying to pry my door open. I wasn't just a random driver who had crashed. I was a target. The thought of what would have happened if my dad had been even a minute later still keeps me awake at night. By my senior year of high school, in the winter of 2022, all I could think about was getting my own car. My hometown in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, was the kind of place where you needed a car for everything, and I was tired of bumming rides off my friends and parents. So, I picked up a job driving for a food delivery app, hoping to save up enough money for a decent used sedan. The work was boring, but it was flexible, and on a good night, I could make a decent amount of cash. On this particular Friday night, a bitter cold had settled over the city. A light icy rain had been falling all day, making the roads slick and treacherous. Most of my friends were at a basketball game or a party, but I was out driving, determined to hit my weekend earnings goal. The orders were coming in steadily, mostly from people who didn't want to venture out into the miserable weather. Around 9 p.m., I got an order request that seemed a little strange. It was a pickup from a fast food burger joint, but the delivery address was what caught my eye. It wasn't a house or an apartment building. The pin on the map was dropped at the intersection of two streets in a rundown industrial area on the west side of town, a place I usually tried to avoid. The customer note simply said, "Meet me at the gas station on the corner." The order itself was also odd, just a single cheeseburger and a small soda. It hardly seemed worth the delivery fee. Still, an order was an order, so I accepted it. I picked up the small, disappointingly light bag of food and started the drive. As I got closer to the destination, the familiar suburban landscape of houses and strip malls gave way to a bleak panorama of old brick warehouses with boarded-up windows, chain-link fences topped with barbed wire, and vast, empty parking lots. It was the kind of place that was probably busy during the day, but was completely deserted at night. The gas station on the corner was exactly as grim as I had imagined. It was an old independent station, not a well-lit chain. Half the letters on its sign were burnt out, and a flickering fluorescent light above the pumps cast long, eerie shadows. I pulled into the empty lot and parked in a spot near the back, away from the pumps. I checked the app. It had notified the customer that I had arrived. I expected someone to come out of the station or maybe flash their headlights from a parked car, but the lot was completely empty. There were no other vehicles, and I couldn't even see an attendant through the dirty windows of the small convenience store. The whole place felt abandoned. After a couple of minutes of waiting, I started to get impatient. I sent a text through the app. "Hi, I'm here with your order. I'm in a silver Honda in the back of the lot." I waited. No response. The little read receipt never appeared. I got out of my car, the cold, damp air immediately seeping into my jacket. I walked around a bit, scanning the dark intersection and the silent warehouses across the street. There was no one. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I was starting to feel like this was a prank. I was about to get back in my car, cancel the order, and enjoy a free cheeseburger when an old pickup truck came rattling down the street and pulled into the gas station. It was a dark red, older model Chevy, covered in rust and mud. Its engine was loud and had a distinct knocking sound. The windows were so heavily tinted that I couldn't see who was inside. Instead of pulling up to the pumps or parking in a normal spot, the truck drove directly toward me. It parked just a couple of spots away, angled in a way that partially blocked my car's easiest exit from the lot. My internal alarm bells started screaming. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and gaunt, with a very disheveled appearance. He wore dirty, torn jeans and a stained flannel jacket that looked way too thin for the weather. His face was pale and unshaven, and his eyes had a hollow, vacant look, but they were locked directly on me. He didn't look like he was expecting a food delivery. He looked like he was expecting a fight. Trying to act normal, I held up the small paper bag with a weak, nervous smile. "Your order here," I said, my voice sounding much higher than usual. The man didn't even glance at the bag. He kept his unnerving gaze fixed on me as he started walking toward me. There was something in his walk, a determined, predatory quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. This was not about a cheeseburger. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was in danger. My brain kicked into survival mode. I made a split-second decision. I dropped the bag of food onto the wet asphalt, turned, and lunged for my car door. The man's reaction was immediate. As soon as he saw me move to leave, he broke into a fast walk, almost a run. "Hey, wait!" he yelled, his voice a rough, angry growl. I scrambled into my car, slammed the door, and fumbled to lock it just as he reached my window. He yanked on the handle, his face contorted with rage. I jammed the key into the ignition and threw the car into reverse. He didn't back away. He ran straight back to his truck, leaving the food lying on the ground. As I sped out of the parking lot, I saw him backing out quickly, his tires squealing. He was going to follow me. I floored it, running a red light to get onto the main road. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the truck's headlights swerving out of the lot, coming after me. What followed was the most terrifying 2 minutes of my life. I weaved through the sparse late-night traffic, my heart pounding against my ribs. The truck was powerful, and it stayed right on my tail. I made a series of panicked, random turns, trying to lose him in the dark side streets. Finally, when I saw the bright lights of a busy main road ahead, I sped toward it. As soon as my car was surrounded by other vehicles, the truck abruptly turned off and disappeared into the darkness. Once I was sure he was gone, I pulled over, my whole body shaking. I called the police, but without a license plate number, there was nothing they could do. I also reported the incident to the delivery app. They confirmed that the customer's account had been created just minutes before placing the order, using a burner email address, and it had been deleted immediately after I reported it. It was a setup. I had been deliberately lured to that isolated, empty gas station. For what reason, I'll never know for sure. But I know that if my instincts hadn't screamed at me to run when they did, I might have found out. I deleted the app that night and never did another delivery again. A used car wasn't worth it. In the fall of 2022, after a particularly bad breakup and a serious case of career burnout, I made the drastic decision to leave the city. I found a small, cheap house for rent in a tiny town in rural Vermont, hoping the peace and quiet would help me reset. I worked from home as a freelance programmer, so I could live anywhere. For the most part, the isolation was exactly what I needed. But as the holidays approached, the quiet started to feel more like loneliness. My family was on the other side of the country, and I couldn't afford the trip, so I was preparing to spend my first Christmas completely alone. My rental house was old and full of character, which was a polite way of saying it was drafty and creaked at all hours. It was surrounded on 3 sides by a dense forest of pine trees, and when the snow came, it muffled all sound, creating a profound, almost unnerving silence. On Christmas Eve, I was trying to get into the holiday spirit, working on a project with some Christmas music playing. Late that night, I heard a sound over the music. It was a distinct rhythmic tapping noise coming from one of the back windows. I muted my speakers and listened. Silence. I got up and walked through the house, checking all the windows. I saw nothing. Figuring it was just a branch tapping against the glass in the wind, I went to the front door to make sure it was locked for the night. As I glanced through the small pane of glass in the door, I saw them. Footprints in the freshly fallen snow on my porch. They were from a pair of large, heavy boots. But they didn't just lead up to my door and back to the driveway. My blood ran cold when I realized the tracks led from the edge of the forest, did a complete circle around my entire house, with distinct pauses underneath each window, and then led back into the dark woods. Someone had been systematically looking into my home. I spent the rest of the night with every light on, jumping at every groan of the old house, feeling watched. Christmas Day was bleak. The festive movies I put on the TV felt hollow and absurd. I had a cheerful video call with my parents, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the footprints. I didn't want to worry them or sound like I was losing my mind. All day, the wind howled and the snow fell, isolating me even further. That evening, as darkness fell, I heard the faint crunching of snow outside again. This time, I didn't go to the door. I turned off all the lights and crept to a front window, peering through a crack in the blinds. I saw a tall figure dressed in dark winter clothing emerge from the trees. He walked calmly and deliberately up my driveway, stepped onto my porch, and stood directly in front of my door for a full minute, perfectly still, as if he were listening for any sound from within. Then, just as calmly, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the forest. It was a methodical, terrifying routine. He was checking on me. Terrified, I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and sat on the couch in the dark living room, determined to stay awake and stand guard. But the anxiety and fear of the last 24 hours had exhausted me. Sometime after midnight, I must have finally drifted off. I woke with a start, not because of a noise, but because of a sudden intense cold. The air in the room felt different. The TV was still on, its silent flickering light illuminating the room. I sat up, the fireplace poker still clutched in my hand. A cold draft was coming from the hallway. I got up and walked toward my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, which was strange since I always slept with it closed. I pushed it open and flicked on the light. My heart stopped. There were wet, snowy footprints on the hardwood floor. They led from the bedroom window, which was now unlocked and open just a crack, to the hallway. They stopped right at the threshold of the living room, at a perfect vantage point to see the couch, to see me sleeping, vulnerable, illuminated by the TV. The footprints then showed the person turning around, walking back through my bedroom, and exiting through the same window they had entered. I stood there in complete shock, a wave of nausea washing over me. He had been inside. He had walked through my house. He had stood in the hallway and watched me sleep. I quickly checked my belongings. My laptop, my wallet, my keys, everything was still there. Nothing was stolen. He didn't come in to rob me. The chilling realization hit me. The violation was the point. He came in just to see me, to watch me when I was at my most helpless. I called the police, but there was little they could do. The intruder had been careful, and the falling snow had already covered his tracks outside. I couldn't stay there another night. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove until I found a motel. The next day, I called my landlord, broke my lease, and within a week, I was back in the city. I never found out who he was or why he chose me, but I can still feel his eyes on me from the dark hallway. The silence of the woods no longer feels peaceful. It feels threatening. The annual 15-hour drive from my apartment in Denver to my parents' house in rural Iowa for the holidays was a grueling tradition I had come to both love and hate. I loved seeing my family, but I dreaded the drive itself, a long, monotonous journey across the frozen plains of Nebraska. This past year, in December of 2023, the drive was even worse than usual. An early, aggressive snowstorm had swept across the region, making the roads a nightmare of ice and low visibility. I had planned to power through in one long haul, fueled by coffee and podcasts, but the weather had other plans. What should have been a 7-hour drive to the halfway point had taken me nearly 12. It was already past midnight. I was utterly exhausted, and my eyes were burning from staring into the swirling snow. I knew I couldn't safely drive any further. I had to find a place to stop for the night. The problem was, I was in the middle of nowhere. The stretch of I-80 I was on was a desolate ribbon of asphalt, cutting through a vast, dark expanse of cornfields. Finally, my GPS showed a single point of interest at the next exit, the Prairie View Motel. It was my only option. I pulled off the highway and onto a dark, unplowed side road. After about a mile, I saw its sign, a flickering, buzzing beacon of pale neon light that seemed to make the darkness around it even deeper. The motel was a long, single-story building, a relic from a bygone era of road trips. The paint was peeling, and the parking lot was a vast, empty expanse of snow. It looked like the kind of place where dreams go to die. As I pulled in, a feeling of profound unease washed over me. It just felt wrong. I parked my car in a random spot near what looked like the main office and got out, the cold, wet air immediately biting at my exposed skin. The office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The front desk was empty. Propped up on the counter was a small, handwritten sign that said, "Be back in 15 minutes," with a crude, smiley face drawing of a coffee cup next to it. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 1 in the morning. Where could the night clerk possibly have gone at this hour, in this weather? The nearest town was at least 20 minutes away. Frustrated and exhausted, I walked back out to my car. As I stood in the empty parking lot, the sheer emptiness of the place finally hit me. I did a slow 360-degree turn. My car was the only vehicle there. Not a single other guest. Not a single employee car. The snow in the parking lot was a smooth, undisturbed blanket, showing no signs of any recent traffic. It didn't just look empty. It felt abandoned, like a forgotten movie set. My rational mind told me to leave, to get back on the highway and drive until I found another town. But my exhausted body overruled it. The thought of getting back behind the wheel was unbearable. I decided I would just wait in my car for the 15 minutes. I turned on the engine for heat, leaned my seat back, and closed my eyes, just for a moment. The next thing I knew, I was being jolted awake. A few hours must have passed. The snow was coming down even harder now, and the wind was rocking my car gently. But it wasn't the wind that had woken me. It was a face. A man's face, pressed up against my driver's side window, his hands cupped around his eyes to peer in. I recoiled in a jolt of pure, cold terror, my heart instantly slamming against my ribs. The man stepped back from the window as I sat up, and he yelled something toward the other side of the parking lot. I looked past him and saw a dark, beat-up pickup truck parked near the entrance, a vehicle that definitely had not been there when I arrived. Another man got out of the driver's side of the truck and started walking quickly toward my car. My mind, still foggy with sleep, finally kicked into gear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a trap. The man who had been at my window walked around to the passenger side of my car and started yanking on the door handle. The other man, the driver of the truck, was now at my door, doing the same. I snapped out of my frozen state and threw the car into reverse, jamming my foot down on the accelerator. The wheels spun uselessly in the thick, wet snow, the engine whining in protest. The men were moving faster now, their initial calm replaced by a frantic urgency. "Get the back window," one of them yelled to the other. I kept trying, shifting between reverse and drive, rocking the car back and forth, desperate to get some traction. Just as I felt the tires begin to grip, the back window of my car exploded inward, showering me with a spray of shattered glass. One of the men was now reaching through the broken window, his arm flailing as he tried to unlock the door from the inside. Just as he got his hand on the interior door handle and half of his body through the window, the tires finally caught. The car shot backward, spinning around in a wide arc. The man who was halfway inside my car was thrown out, tumbling onto the snowy pavement. The other man scrambled to get back into his truck to follow me as I turned the car and sped toward the exit of the parking lot. I didn't look back. I flew out onto the side road and back onto the highway, my foot pressed to the floor, the freezing wind and snow blasting in through my shattered back window. I drove for an hour, fueled by pure adrenaline, before I dared to pull over at a brightly lit 24-hour truck stop. I sat there for a long time, my whole body shaking, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. I called the police and told them everything. I realized then that the motel wasn't just a failing business. It was a hunting ground. The "Be back in 15 inches" sign wasn't for a coffee break. It was bait, a lure to get a desperate, exhausted driver to stop and wait. The empty parking lot wasn't a sign of a slow night. It was a carefully prepared trap. I had willingly parked my car and fallen asleep in the middle of their kill zone. The thought of what those men had planned for me and what they would have done if I hadn't woken up is a horror that I will carry with me for the rest of my life.